Overdose is likely the cause of another inmate death at Waupun Correctional Institution. That's according to the city mayor. The seventh death there, and it comes less than a year after the former warden and several members of his staff were charged with misconduct and felony inmate abuse. In a First Alert update, Jason Zimmerman spoke to the mayor this afternoon and other sources about the incident. He's live in our newsroom with what he learned. Jason.
Bill, that inmate has been identified as 23-year-old Damian Evans, and according to the Department of Corrections, Evans died on Tuesday. No other specifics are being released, but the mayor is pointing to drugs, telling me smuggling continues to be a huge problem at the prison. With the governor pushing a $500 million prison reform plan, which includes repurposing Waupun as a medium security prison and vocational village for training inmates, it's once again in the spotlight over a person who died in custody.
As I understand it, the person who passed away was going to get out in a couple of weeks. So he was young, and anytime a young person dies, it's a tragedy.
Court records show Damian Evans was sentenced in 2019 to 7 years in prison for armed robbery and an additional 2 years to be served concurrently for bail jumping. Both cases were filed in Racine County.
In this case, I'm hearing it sounds like a drug overdose, and that's on kind of the security wing of the Department of Corrections, and it's a constant struggle for them. People are always trying to smuggle things in, and somehow they get in when they're not supposed to.
Evans is the seventh Waupun inmate to have died in custody since June 2023. 2 died by suicide, 1 died of a fentanyl overdose, 1 of a stroke, and 1 of dehydration and malnutrition. Prosecutors last year charged Warden Randall Hepp with misconduct and 8 members of his staff with felony inmate abuse in connection to the deaths of 2 of the prisoners, Cameron Williams and Donald Meyer. Several groups working to support people behind bars have been calling for the prison to be closed.
What's been going on there is a humanitarian crisis. People have been tortured, people have been dying. What's happened is not acceptable, and it's really time for more independent oversight of Wisconsin Department of Corrections.
A decision on the prison's future still in question as Republican lawmakers and the governor attempt to reach a deal on the prison reform package in the state's biennial budget. That is expected to happen sometime before July. Bill, back to you.
Jason.